Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cut Off podcast. In this episode, we're going to pull behind the curtain to reveal how alienators operate, the tactics they use, and how they create chaos and confusion for both parents and children. If you've ever felt blindsided, confused, or constantly under attack by false accusations, this conversation is for you. Today, we're helping you recognize those psychological warfare tactics so you can stop reacting from pain and start responding with clarity, strategy, and resilience. Marisa, this is a huge topic. Let's start by unpacking what's really inside the Alienator's toolkit. So, when we say Alienator's toolkit, what exactly are we talking about? What manipulation strategies do alienators tend to use to pull others, especially children, into their narrative?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Susanna. So, since alienators prioritize their need for power, control, and domination really above anything else, they don't often exhibit the moral boundaries that other people would adhere to, and that's why the usual moral lines don't stop them. So, for anyone raised in a steady, loving family, functional family, parental alienation, it often can seem really unbelievable to them and hard to grasp. Because it's unthinkable that someone would use a child as a weapon and dismiss the damage that they might be doing to that child. There's a lot of tactics they can use. One of the most prominent tactics is triangulation. And a recap of that is it's really essentially turning the child into a messenger or a referee. And they're doing it in a manner where they're always purposely making the parent who's being alienated looking inept or unsafe or unstable. An example of that might be is the parent that's inflicting the alienation might say to the child, they'll put that child in the middle and they'll say, tell your father or your mother that I'm not changing weekends again. I'm not, they're unreliable and I'm not doing it. And, or they could say something like, your mom said this about me. So they're, to put it in layman's terms, they're constantly bad-mouthing the other parent to that child, but they're doing it in a way where they're providing them a little bit of context and data so the child can link it together. They're never allowing the child to see the full picture or looking at it from the other parent's perspective. So what happens is the impact is the child could feel pressure to become the adult and feel pressure to choose sides and manage the conflict. And, when that type of strife is constantly being perpetuated, the child's going to get irritated. They're going to feel run down. They're going to feel upset. And they're going to project those feelings onto the parent that they're being told is causing this discomfort in their life. But the key point is really children should never be the bridge between adult disagreements. This is something that unfortunately happened to me. One of my sons was told during custody exchanges he was told to provide information to me back and forth. Really, the take-home point of this is children should never be the bridge between parents and be placed in a position where they feel like they have to be the relay of adult communication. Especially when there's so much contention and irritation. The only time that children should be, of course, a bridge or discussing things in the middle is if there's healthy communication and there's no animosity and there's not purposeful mistreatment, not purposeful ill will, but that's never the case with parental alienation. So unfortunately, what happens with triangulation is repeatedly that child is being placed in the middle to assume adult responsibilities, and therefore they start feeling somehow responsible for what's happening as they're developing, as they're being placed in the middle of these adult conversations and communications. They're becoming irritated and they're becoming angry because these are things that they'll even say, this is out of my control. I don't want to talk about this. But nonetheless, they're being placed in a point of responsibility and hearing things that they shouldn't. So a key point is children should never be the bridge between communication between the parents. They really shouldn't. And specifically not when there's so much resentment and ill content between the parents. And that's what is happening with triangulation. The child is constantly being placed in a position where they're hearing unfortunate things about the other parent and they're made to feel somehow responsible for it. And they're being placed in a position where they feel that they almost need to do something to try to assuage the circumstances and make it better. And it's always to shine a negative light on that parent that's being alienated. Another example of triangulation is black and white thinking, or an all or nothing mentality. So what it could look like is a parent, as an example, might say, if you love me, you won't go with him or her, or he's all bad, or I'm all good. And what happens is the impact is the child loses the ability to hold mixed feelings. One parent becomes the hero and the other becomes the villain. There's really no nuances in the relationship. So when you see that, where a child paints one parent as completely a negative force in their lives, and the other parent is almost placed on the pedestal as if they're the angel and they're the savior, then that's another example of parental alienation. Or an example of not just parental alienation, but their toolkit that they're using. So what's important here to understand is healthy relationships, they always allow gray areas. Alienation, what it does is it removes that nuance on purpose. Another example of the toolkit that they may use is coercive control, which is emotional or logistical restriction. And what it can look like is the parents, they can be monitoring calls and texts. They can be punishing the child after visits and making them pay for showing love to the other side, or even at times recanting a good memory, or even evoking that parent's name, or something that they may have done that with them that weekend. So what happens is the child learns that affection towards one parent means losing safety with the other. One thing I asked my daughter, I asked her, I said, can you talk about mommy or what you did with the weekend during your time with me, with your father and his family? And she says, no, I'm not allowed to, because if I talk about it, they'll get angry. So it's almost like, they have no choice. They have to let her go with me. But their way of voicing their discontent with the fact that she sees me is she's not allowed to express herself at all, is from what I gather from talking to her. And it's so emotionally damaging to a child, because when she says this, in my circumstance, she starts to cry a little bit, because she's being taught early on that she can't talk about her day. She can't talk about what she experienced. It's not supported, and it's unfortunate. And if I say to her, in response, I say, well, what did you do over the weekend with dad? Did you have fun? Just normal conversation. So her response to me will be, well, I'm not allowed to talk about what I did with him to you. And it's such an unhealthy dynamic to raise a child. And unfortunately, that's something that's very common in parental alienation. And repetition and brainwashing is something that is just repeated. It's something that occurs continuously over time. The thing with parental alienation is it's not a one-time occurrence. This becomes the dynamic that the child is raised in, and it's just an ongoing, purposeful circumstance that just takes on a life of its own and becomes the relationship, becomes the standard with these children, with how they're raised. If you can't do it, if you're not fortunate enough to try to interject and try to stop it. So what it could look like is the other parent could say, she abandoned us, even if it's untrue. Photos can be removed. History is basically rewritten. And what the impact is the child could start repeating phrases that they couldn't even possibly know or understand. So that's one of the biggest red flags. Terminology for that is parroting. So the child will say phrases or use words that were out of their vernacular. And one of the points to take home with this is if a child sounds rehearsed, someone's been running the rehearsals. So it's such a challenging dynamic to try to mitigate, because, again, you can't control what's being said or what's happening when your child is with the other parent. All you can do is control yourself and yourself and how you interact with that child. But this is why it's so essential, I think, for clinicians and the legal system to understand this, because in a lot of respects, the parent that's being alienated, it's an uphill battle for them. It really can be, because guilt is, for that child, it's being used as a weapon. So, as an example, a parent might say, well, I'm really sad when you're gone, or I miss you tremendously, or you're all I have, don't leave me. So that child is made to feel shameful in some regards when they go and visit the other parent. And the impact, of course, is the child feels responsible for fixing the adult's emotions. So when they see their parents upset, they feel inclined to do something if they care about them. And kids aren't supposed to be emotional support animals. They need to receive care and not provide it. So, and that's one thing I'm always conscientious about. If I get upset in front of my daughter, she'll say to me she doesn't like to see me unhappy, and which of course wonderful. She's a caring child, but it's really not. It's not healthy for her to see me unhappy all the time. And I always make a point not to say to her, "Well, I'll miss you when you leave. I'm sad to see you go." It's just that's such an emotional burden to put on your child. But that's one thing that alienators they don't think about the damage that they may be causing to their child when they do that. Another prime example in their toolkit is oversight and interrogation. So, as an example, they might say, "Who was there? What did they say? Did she mention me?" So as soon as the child comes home from being with that parent, they have a slew of questions right off the bat. They want to know exactly what happened and when, even though on the flip side, they're being encouraged not to provide any information to that child about what's happening when they're with them. So the impact would be the child becomes anxious, guarded, and afraid to say the wrong thing. So they learn really quickly to hide their emotions, be rehearsed, and mask any type of joy that they may have been experiencing with that parent. And monitoring, it's not really about protection. It's basically surveillance dressed up as concern. So really, I think the crucial point here to understand is alienation. It's not always loud. It's often quiet, subtle, and disguised as love. It's disguised as protection, or the other parent could be saying something like, "I'm just being honest." So the best way to spot it is by watching what it does to the child. Does that child feel free to love both sides, or are they being forced to choose one side over the other?
One tactic our listeners mention a lot is gaslighting. We hear that word often, but in the context of alienation, it takes on a very specific form. So in your perspective, Marisa, how does an alienator use gaslighting to distort the child's reality?
Sure. So gaslighting is one of the most insidious tools a parent or a family-based alienation is employing, because it doesn't just poison the child against someone, it rewrites their entire perception of reality. So some common gaslighting tactics used against children could be rewriting past examples or events. An example might be, "Your dad never attended your school plays. I was the only one who showed up," even though that child remembers otherwise. And what happens is the child begins to mistrust their own memories and relies on the alienator to supply the truth. So when they're constantly being fed lies and mistruths, or being their memories are being altered, or their perception of reality is being altered, they start questioning their own judgment. Or they could be even denying the positive experiences. So the child might say, "Well, I remember that vacation. I know for a fact that mom did this with me, and I had fun at her house." And the alienator might reply, "You only think that because she manipulates you. She doesn't really care about you." And the impact is joy is reframed as delusion. So the child starts to fear feeling good about the other parent. And when they're doing this, often their feelings are being minimized or mocked. An example might be, "You're not scared, you're just being brainwashed," or "You don't miss them, you're just confused." So whenever the child sort of volleys back with even a hint of something positive or kind, the alienator is often quick to nip that in the bud and try to rewrite their recollection of the events and rephrase how they're feeling. So the child, what happens is they learn that their emotions are wrong unless approved by the alienator, and they begin to the real insidious thing here is it's not just their memories are being altered, of course, with that parent, which is incredibly damaging, but the child learns that they can't trust themselves. They can't trust their own memories, and they learn that they always have to check in with that other parent just to make sure that their thoughts and feelings are valid. So another example might be, a prime example might be inventing false intentions or hidden motives. So an example could be, he only calls you to make himself look good, or she buys you gifts to buy your love. And anytime that, again, the child that has any positive experience with that parent that's being alienated, and they have a recollection of that, or they voice that that rarely goes. If there's an opportunity to paint that parent badly, they will. There's really no bounds at which the alienator will cross. The parent that's purposely doing the alienating, they don't have the moral guidelines that most of us would. They don't employ that. So if they feel like there's an opportunity to flip the roles and paint themselves as a victim, they will. So they might say, I'm the one who sacrificed everything, but somehow I'm the bad guy. And the impact might be the child feels guilty for questioning or pulling away from the alienator, even when the mistreatment is obvious. So the psychological impact could be they no longer trust their own memories or their instincts. I think it's essential to understand that when an alienator uses gaslighting, they're not just attacking the relationship between the child and the targeted parent, they're attacking the child's mind itself. So instead of simply saying, don't love them, they teach the child, you can't trust what you feel unless I confirm it.
That actually leads perfectly into the next one, false narratives. We've seen, cases where children repeat stories that clearly don't come from their own experience. And in your experience, what are some of the most common false narratives or accusations you see being planted in the child's mind?
Sure. But this is an essential component to understand when discussing parental alienation. It's very challenging to know how children might recite lies that have been told to them and subsequently begin to believe them. Alienation is such a deliberate act, and the alienating party knows that they can't suddenly just change a child's mind and recollection of their own experiences one day. So what happens is it's this gradual, purposeful intent. Alienation, it rarely starts with outright lies. It often will begin with distorted truths. A child remembers one moment when a parent got upset, or perhaps a parent made a mistake, and the alienating party will inflate that moment into a permanent character label. So common false narratives planted in alienate children. An example of this might be a normal parenting moment becomes evidence of abuse in a child's memory. So an example would be a child might remember when their parent became upset with them and yelled at them because they did something wrong repeatedly over and over again. And the parent will say, remember that, she was unstable. She was always yelling. She was always angry with you. You're lucky that you survived that. You're lucky that you don't have to deal with that anymore. And what happens is the alienator reinforces it by saying, see, that's who they really are. And so when a child brings up a past negative experience they had with a parent, because every child has those, the alienator won't miss that opportunity to capitalize on that and reiterate that if they're able to. Kindness also can get reframed as manipulation. So if the child might say, my parent took me here or bought a gift, the alienator would say, well, she only buys that. She only buys you things or does those things to buy your love. So same with phone calls, hugs, anything, any kind gesture that parent does. The alienator is rarely going to do anything to reinforce that, to make that child feel good about that circumstance. They're going to find a way to try to paint that as it was a manipulative on the other parent's part. Neutral actions can become proof of rejection. So as an example, if the parent has to work late or they have to drop them off early or they can't make a recital or a game, the other parent, certainly they'll jump at that opportunity to remind that child of that time that they weren't able to go or that parent wasn't there. The alienator, they play the truth revealer, which is they might say to the child, you're too young to understand now, but when you're older, you'll see how much they hurt you. And what they do too is they're constantly putting that child in a place where they're being made to feel like if they have an inkling that they want to say something positive about that other parent, they're being made to feel that their feelings and their experiences aren't valid. And if there's any question, the parent could volley back and say, in time you'll understand. This is beyond your comprehension now. What it does is it creates also an anticipatory resentment, so that child could start to expect some type of betrayal or mistreatment, even when nothing's happened yet. But it's setting that child up for some type of disapproval or letdown. It's true. Our reality becomes how we see it. So if that child goes, and the next time that child goes to visit that parent, and they already have this predisposed notion that it's not going to go well, they're not going to do anything to support they're not going to do anything to support a positive experience with their parent. So you might ask, what happens? What makes these narratives so effective? And alienators, they don't have to invent entirely new fictional stories. They only have to take a small truth, exaggerate it, repeat it, and then attach fear or shame to it. So what happens is soon the child believes it, not because it happened, but because they feel it must have been true all along.
And what do you think really drives that? Because on the surface, it looks like, revenge, but sometimes it can feel deeper, right? Maybe even pathological. And from your perspective, what's the true motivation behind this consistent need to control the child and destroy the other parent's image? Is it revenge or personality disorder or maybe something else?
Yeah, so the motivation behind parental alienation, it's really just one thing. And on the surface, it might look like revenge. And in some cases, it absolutely is. But it's really much more complex than that. It's rooted in something much deeper. It could be a pathological need for control. There's always an aspect of control involved there, regardless. It's fueled by insecurity, entitlement, and an unstable sense of self. In my case, I believe a big part of what drove it was selfishness, paired with an unrelenting desire to dominate the emotional landscape and control. Once an alienator successfully convinces a child that they are the good parent and the other is the bad, they've built this identity on their narrative. And at that point, it's not just about controlling the child. It becomes about maintaining power at all costs. Because of this, if they were to admit, even slightly, that the other parent is capable of love, of goodness, of growth, of anything positive, really, then their entire structure that they've so meticulously built will collapse. So they've built a world where they must always be right. And if they're always right, then they're never held accountable for anything that they've done wrong. So at some point, the alienation, it stops being just a tactic, and it stops being deliberate, purposeful, everyday language. It just becomes a belief system that the child is indoctrined into. And that's why you see such extreme overreactions to even normal parental behavior. They can't risk the child seeing balance or nuance because nuance threatens their dominance. So in psychological terms, it aligns with traits seen in narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality structures, where the person, they operate through splitting, emotional black and white thinking and fear of abandonment. So is it revenge? That's a simplistic way of saying it. Sometimes. Is it a personality disorder? In many cases, yes. But the research supports that more than anything, it's a self-preservation of a false identity built on control. So alienators, they don't just need the child, they need the role of being the heroic victim. They'll protect that role more fiercely than they'll protect the child's mental health.
Thanks for that explanation. That really makes sense. And, meanwhile, the targeted parent often ends up internalizing all this. How do these tactics specifically lead parents to feel ashamed or silenced or even start doubting their own worth?
Yeah, so people, they often focus on what alienation does to the child, and rightfully so. The child is the primary concern in the court system, the legal system. That's what, after all, this is all about, is the impact on the child primarily. But on the same token, we don't really talk enough about what happens to the targeted parent. Because these tactics, they don't just block access to your child, they attack your identity as the parent that's being alienated. So for a loving, active parent, being present, caring, nurturing, protecting. It's not just something you do, it's who you are. So when your child suddenly will pull away, reject you, and start questioning your motives, it does more than hurt your feelings. It shatters your sense of self, and I can attest to that. Alienation, it makes you question your own worth. So you start thinking, if my own child doesn't even trust me, maybe I really did fail. Maybe I wasn't enough. You start questioning your sense of worth, because it's something that when it happens and it's so pronounced and so it can be so severe and so disorienting to parents. It's very hard for it not to impact their identity. So when the lies and the manipulation persist and you can't seem to break through from that child's new mindset of how their perception is of the parent, that's when the real shame, it starts to set in. You're not just grieving the loss of the connection of your child. You're grieving the person that you once were before all of this. And in a way, you were before parents become alienated, they never think about how this could happen to me. It's not something that really I can attest as a parent. It's not something that I ever considered. I mean, as a parent, you think about the worst case scenarios. You think about your child being abducted or hurt or injured, or all those things that happen. Also in mainstream media, school violence, things like that. You think about that. You never really consider that one day your child could be purposely turned against you. It's just not something that is on our scope of consciousness, I think, in this country. So when it happens, it catches many parents completely off guard, even though they, of course, could be living in a toxic circumstance or an unhappy relationship, because let's be honest, this doesn't happen. It doesn't stem from a relationship that's ideal. They still don't consider this as a possibility. So getting back to the point, what happens is you're grieving a version of yourself that you thought you were. So a question that a lot of parents may ask themselves is, they're going to beat themselves up. They're going to say, why didn't I stop this earlier? Why didn't I see the warning signs? Why did I stay in a toxic relationship so long? And I said all those things to myself because I'm an educated professional, and I really was shocked and really blindsided when it happened to me. Despite the fact that my relationship was far from ideal, I just didn't think that people were capable of this type of behavior. So because alienation, it's almost never an isolated event. It's usually the end result of something much deeper, a long-term relationship dynamic, one that was manipulative or controlling, but maybe never fully acknowledged. So you're not just battling an internal war, you're battling an internal war within yourself. So at the same time, you're being forced to see truths about yourself and your relationship where maybe you didn't address things that you should have in a timely manner. So I will say it's why alienation is so devastating. It doesn't just take away your child. It tries to rewrite your identity and silence you before you can even defend yourself.
Thanks, Marisa. And to some of the listeners who want to hear more about the red flags, you can go to cut off episode 3, the previous episode that we have. But let's move on now to what happens inside the child, because while all this manipulation is happening, the child is the one, caught in an emotional tug of war that they never asked for. So what are some behavioral signs, for example, that show a child is struggling with these artificially created loyalty conflicts?
That's an excellent way of putting it. While all this manipulation is happening, the child is trapped in an emotional tug of war that they never really asked to join. You'll start to see in their behavior long before their dialogue or words can catch up that they're not bad kids necessarily or rebellious kids, but they're children in conflict. So they'll try to survive in two competing realities. One of the earliest signs could be a sudden emotional distance. So a child that was once affectionate with their parent, they can become hostile towards that parent. but what's striking is their lack of proportional reason. So, I mean, we all have disagreements, and a child that might volley back and talk back to the parent, or have a disagreement, or a circumstance that wasn't necessarily harmonious, they won't let that go. They'll hold on to that resentment for a ridiculous extent of time that they never would have done in the past. You'll see the black and white thinking. The alienated parent is all good, as I had touched before. Another sign is excessive guilt or hypervigilance. So they might watch what they say around that parent, terrified of betraying the other side. And you can see it in that child's eyes. They're constantly scanning for approval or censoring themselves. You might also notice inconsistent behavior across environments. The child might be warm and relaxed with you in private, but cold and dismissive the moment the alienated parent enters the room or texts them. So this split behavior, it's a hallmark of divided loyalty. And I had mentioned before, another red flag is scripted language or parroting. So some children, though, they can show people-pleasing behaviors as well, which is a form of overcompensation. So with the alienating parent, they could play caretaker. They could try to keep the peace. And others might become defiant, oppositional, even cruel towards the targeted parent, because cruelty earns praise or protection elsewhere. So they're being rewarded if they were to go back to the alienated parent and say, you know, I stood up to mom or dad and I told them off and I told them they were wrong about this. So the alienating side will praise them, and you know, they won't miss that opportunity. So in psychological terms, this is called identification with the aggressor. So a survival mechanism where the child, they're subconsciously aligning more with the powerful parent to feel safe. So when you see these behavioral shifts, the coldness, the mimicry, the anxiety, you're not seeing a child who hates their parent. You're seeing a child trying to stay safe in a system that punishes love and rewards loyalty, really. And that's the tragedy of alienation. It forces children to fracture their own hearts in order to maintain their belonging.
You often talk about emotional triangulation, and I think that's actually something a lot of parents are seeing without realizing what it is. Can you explain that in simple terms for a parent who might be watching it unfold right now and they might be not realizing what is happening?
Definition of triangulation in plain language is when one parent will pull the child into adult conflict instead of protecting them from it. So it turns a two-person issue into a three-person power struggle is what it does. It puts that child in the middle constantly of having to be the mediator, not just the mediator, but report back to that alienating parent. And it's an early sign of parental alienation when that child is still in that parent's life, but it's a very predominant sign. An example might be, tell your dad that I'm not paying for that, or your mom is mad at me again. Do you think she's being fair? The child, they're forced to become the messenger, the referee, and the therapist. And what happens is that child will feel responsible for keeping the peace and become resentful. And they carry adult emotions such as guilt, anxiety, and pressure. They should never have to feel responsible for things that they really have no power, no control over. They don't belong being placed in a position such as this. And they lose the freedom to love both parents safely. A way it might manifest behaviorally is the child could start delivering messages or taking sides, and the child can become defensive of one parent. And it will change the tone or the personality depending on who they're with. So they might act as the caretaker or the go-between. And parents, they often miss it, unfortunately, because first and foremost, there's already an unhealthy dynamic established between the communication of the parents. So in some regards, the children, unfortunately, they are communicating back and forth, and it can happen without really the parent that's being alienated, their understanding of what's occurring initially. Because in a way, perhaps they could be relieved that they don't have to talk to that parent that moment and experience the backlash and the anger and the hostility. So when a child passes a message on to them, they take it in stride, and it's almost like a reprieve. But unfortunately, that child still should never be placed in that position where they have to be the go-between between those parents. And it can sound casual or harmless, like, to that parent. It could be prefaced with just tell your mother, just tell your father. But what happens is when it's repeated over time, it erodes boundaries. And it's disguised as communication, but it's actually just manipulation. So what's important to remember here is the goal of triangulation. It's never communication. It's really about control. It keeps tension alive, and it forces the child to prove loyalty. So you might want to know, what's an alternative? What can you do instead of allow this to happen? And direct communication between the adults, no matter how uncomfortable. So whether if they can't talk in person, whether it's texting, whether it's through an app, there needs to be another form of communication. The child should never be incumbent upon the child to relay messages back and forth between the parents. And really what you can do as the parent is you can reassure the child and say, you don't have to take sides. The adults will handle it. So when you do that, what it does is it creates an emotional safety by removing them from the triangle.
And then there's also the psychological splitting, which is really heartbreaking. The child starts seeing one parent as all good and the other one as all bad, as you've explained. So how does that show up, for example, in a child's day-to-day behavior?
Sure. So the core idea of splitting is the child's mind is divides the world into all good versus all bad to cope with the stress and the loyalty conflict. So it's a survival response to emotional tension. It's not defiance, or it's cruel, and it's not cruelty. So how it manifests from day to day is there's an idealization and a de-evaluation that occurs simultaneously. So the one parent becomes perfect, they can do no wrong, and the other parent becomes dangerous and worthless. And the child will take on absolutes. As an example, my mother's amazing, my father ruins everything. And it's extremely rigid way of thinking. There's no gray areas, there's no mixed emotions. There's struggles to hold two truths. So love for both parents, it feels completely unsafe. And the interesting thing about this is even children who come from, who have a parent that's neglectful or abusive or not an ideal parent, and there's not parental alienation occurring, they still will hold fond memories of that parent. They'll still want to, reconnect with that parent. They'll still want to feel love. They'll still have this deep desire to somehow fix the circumstance. But with parental alienation, it's something that often is missed by the legal system and by the healthcare system, is when that child completely paints that parent as this negative force. That is something that's unique in parental alienation that doesn't happen in anything else. So what happens is mirroring the child's emotions, the child will copy tone, the phrasing, even body language of the parent that's doing the alienating. So because that parent is placed on this pedestal, they'll do everything they can to live up to their standards. And if that means mimicking them and how they talk, then they'll do that. What will happen is they'll react to the targeted parent with the same contempt, the same alienating expressions. And the outcome is there's a sudden personality shift. So they could be loving at school or with relatives, but hostile with the targeted parent. And there's two versions of this child depending on who's present. So when this occurs, there's cruelty that's justified because that child's being put in a position where they feel morally superior, rejecting the parent as if they deserve it. And they'll show pride or relief in siding with the good parent. There's a loss of empathy. There's a loss of curiosity. They stop asking questions. They don't want facts. They already know everything. So they display this emotional flatness when confronted with the other parent's pain. So what I'll say is psychological splitting, it's the child's way of surviving an impossible choice. When love for one parent feels like betrayal of the other, the only way to stay safe for that child is to choose a side completely. And it's so, this receiving parent, when they experience this, it just seems so cruel and so unthinkable. And it takes a lot to understand that really the child is behaving this way subconsciously. They don't realize it because it's a survival mechanism. It's how they've now been more or less brainwashed to behave and think and how to proceed with life. On a practical note, it doesn't have to be permanent. It's protective. So healing can begin when a child feels safe enough to see nuance again, when they can see that both parents are human and imperfect and they still love them. So it doesn't have to be a permanent circumstance. Of course, if there's the right interjection, and if children are given an opportunity to spend time with that other parent, and that other parent can provide a safe and loving support system with them, and they use their time wisely with them, they can break free of this and they can change the child's perception.
Thank you, Marisa. Now that we've, gone behind the curtain and exposed the Alienator's playbook with all the gaslighting, false stories, manipulation, let's talk about what parents can do. When you're under that kind of attack, how does a targeted parent avoid getting reactive and pulled into the drama?
Yeah, this is such a challenging question to definitively answer because everyone's circumstance and situation is unique. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution by any means. So there are, however, basic fundamental framework principles that focus on mastering your emotional responses and actions instead of attempting to control or alter how others are behaving, which you can never succeed in doing that, right? Parental alienation, it's when inflicted, it's psychological warfare at its finest, really. And it's essential that a parent subject to this learn to move and formulate the behavior with this in mind. So some key points that anyone can really embody are you can recognize the setup. The alienator wants you to be reactive. When you become angry or unhinged, or any one of those negative emotions, and it's apparent in your reactions, what happens is it validates their story. You can realize, like, every outburst or every time you become overly defensive or your responses aren't measured, it becomes evidence for that child that the alienator was correct. So really, calmness, it's your counter strategy. Some of these tools you can apply to really other things in life too, but before you respond, you should pause. You could use the 3-breath rule. You could inhale, exhale, and wait 3 seconds. And what that does, it gives you a chance to really recalibrate your emotional responses and decide the best way to react. You can ask yourself, will this response help my child feel safer or prove the alienator right? So even if something is being said that's completely untrue, and I'm not saying you have to validate that child's feelings, but your response could be calm, it can be measured, and it can be reassuring to your child. You could say something to the extent of, I hear you, I understand that that's how you recall things, and but I'm very sorry. I'm sorry that you've been put through this, and it saddens me that we even have to have this discussion. I'm sorry that we have to have this discussion, and I'm sorry that you're hurting right now. And when you say that, you're validating the child's feelings, but you're not necessarily validating what's not true. So you can detach from the narrative. You can debate your way. You can't debate your way out of a false story, essentially, but you can choose peace over proof. So another thing you can do away from your child is you can document the facts privately. You don't have to perform them publicly. So every time a child, has something to say, or every time this false narrative is being perpetuated, and if you're in the unfortunate circumstance where you're in a legal battle, I think it's imperative, and it's also important for your own sanity too, is because again, this isn't a one-time occurrence. This is something that happens repeatedly over a period of time. and your memories can start to become jumbled. You can start to question your own reality. So when things like this happen, if you take a moment and you jot them and you journal them down, it helps build a case too, not just for yourself, but a legal case too when you present it. Really, the main priority when you're with your child is to stay focused on that child. Your goal should not be to win the argument, which is completely different perspective when parenting, because as parenting, as parents, we're on the role of, we take on the role of educator, and we're responsible for our child's safety and shaping their morals and their values. And when you have the dynamic of parental alienation, it's so incredibly challenging because you're put in this position where you want to disagree with your child and you want to correct them, because that's what parents do. They correct their children. But you really have to go about it in a way that is not being that you're not being argumentative with that child, because every time you argue or you disagree or you show the slightest bit of anger, that can be misperceived by that child. So as I said, you always want to regulate before you communicate. You want to use boundaries, not battles. So limit direct engagement with the alienator as well, because that alienator will take the opportunity to try to prod you or try to do something that's going to upset you. So if at all costs, you want to limit your exposure to the alienator. I will say it's essential to sum this up is to reframe the goal. You're really not trying to win back your child's loyalty at this point. What you need to do during this process, you're trying to model emotional maturity. Children eventually remember who stayed calm when things were chaotic. So this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. So every interaction you have with your child, you have to keep that in mind. You can't think every time that you're going to try to resolve all of the issues and all the problems. So when given the opportunity with your children, each time you're with them, you need to set a fresh foot forward and address their concerns that day. What you don't want to do is rehash all of the issues and all the problems that have been going on. You really want to focus on rebuilding your relationship with your child and attending to their emotional needs, but also showing the most positive side of you as the parent with them.
From the child's perspective, why is staying calm, not taking the bait, not bad-mouthing the other parent actually the most powerful counter tactic against the alienator's pressure?
Yeah. So children are watching for truth, not perfection. So calm consistency speaks louder than any defense or accusation. So children are, and the children who are being alienated, they're already on guard, on lookout. They're looking for a chance to align with the alienator's accusations. So if you go out of your way to prove them wrong, to maintain a calm manner, and really reinforce a positive relationship with your child, it doesn't matter what is said to that child. They're going to think, well, that wasn't my experience with mom or dad. I'll just keep it quiet. But really, it's not what you say. It's how you act around your child. So from the child's emotional viewpoint, children are going to gravitate towards whoever feels emotionally safe. And that's not necessarily right. So if that parent fosters an environment where the child feels supported, safe, and able to talk and express their concerns, whether or not their language is hostile, their concerns aren't necessarily rooted in truth, or they're not valid. If the child feels like they have the opportunity to be themselves, to express their needs and concerns, and that other parent's going to listen to them without overreacting or reacting in a harsh manner, then they're going to begin to feel safe with that parent again. Predictability, it equals peace. So when one home stays stable and calm, it gives their nervous system a break from chaos. So when they're with you as the parent and you foster, again, a relationship that's calm, that's supportive, that's kind, that's going to undo the negative manipulation that's occurring on the other side. Children, they'll test both sides. They may provoke you to see if you'll match the anger that they've been told to expect. And when you don't, it quietly just confirms the alienator's narrative. So why staying calm, it really does work. It really is the solution to this problem, is it breaks the script. The alienator story depends on your reaction. So when you refuse to play the role of angry or unstable, the story, it'll lose traction. And it models also, too, in the long run, it will model emotional regulation for that child. So children learn what self-control looks like by feeling it in your presence. And it'll build long-term trust. Over time, they remember who stayed grounded when everyone else was reactive. So it's very tempting as the parent who's being alienated against to badmouth. It's very tempting not to be retaliatory. But what happens is it backfires because it confirms the alienator's warnings, and they could say, see, they're toxic. So if you were to say something bad about that other parent, that child will go back and inform them. And immediately that just, it enforces the unfortunate narrative that that other parent is trying to build. It forces the child to protect the other parent to reduce anxiety, and it can make the child feel trapped. Loyalty becomes survival. So again, if you start, when you're the receiving parent of alienation and you start bad-mouthing the other parent, immediately that just reinforces the negative perception that child has, and they'll be anxious to get away from you as soon as possible. So every calm response, it's a quiet contradiction of the lies that you've heard. So you don't have to defend your character. You just have to really embody it.
Sounds like that takes a lot of strength and self-control. But, once a parent understands these tactics and starts recognizing them for what they are, it's like the fog begins to lift, right? How do you think targeted parents take this knowledge and turn it into empowerment, shifting from being a victim of tactics to become an advocate, a survivor, or maybe even a teacher for others?
Yeah. So knowledge without action, it keeps you stuck. So awareness leads to agency, and that leads to advocacy. So the first step is reclaiming your identity, is mastering yourself within. You're more than what the story is told about you. You can redefine yourself as a parent in progress, not a parent erased. And you anchor your self-worth in how you show up, not in how you're perceived. So there's a shift from reaction to intention. So instead of chasing the false narratives that are being perpetuated about you, you can start living your truth out loud. You can stay calm. You can exemplify consistent behavior. That's really your advocacy. Every patient loving act, it's a quiet proof of your character. So you can educate yourself and others. That's another thing that you can do where it will help with your empowerment. You can learn the psychology of triangulation, of splitting, of gaslighting, so you can name what you're experiencing, because I've found that to be extremely helpful. You share that language with support groups, schools, parents. Really, knowledge is power in this. Like with everything else, it certainly applies to parental alienation. And your story doesn't just become data. It becomes data, but it doesn't just live as drama anymore. You can build support and purpose. So isolation, it fuels shame. So connection restores perspective with people. One thing that's helped me is I've joined advocacy communities. So you can attend awareness events. You can mentor a newly targeted parent. And what happens is you start turning your pain into purpose, and it rewires helplessness into leadership. So, and in turn, the ultimate outcome is this, it models resilience for the child. You can show them what recovery looks like. You can let them witness you living with integrity, with gratitude, and with grace, even after this tremendous loss. And really, that's the ultimate counter narrative to alienation. So empowerment, it doesn't just mean that the pain disappears, because it never really does. It can mean that the pain now has a purpose, and that's to teach, to protect, and to help others find their voice sooner than you did. So if you've lived through parental alienation, it doesn't just break your heart, it breaks the rhythm of your entire life. And survival doesn't have to be where your story ends. It really doesn't. Once you start seeing the patterns clearly, whether it's the gaslighting, the manipulation, the emotional tug of war, you also start seeing something else, and that can be your own strength. So it could be the strength it took to keep showing up when no one believed you, the courage it took to stay kind in the face of cruelty. And every time I'll say you choose calm over chaos, love over anger, and dignity over despair, you're not just surviving anymore. You're teaching. So you're modeling integrity for your child and for everyone else who's silently watching how you might carry this. So this shift from victim to advocate, it can begin the moment you decide that your story will not end in bitterness, but in clarity. Because truthfully, the same knowledge that once broke you, it can become the wisdom to heal others. So I'll say that's what inspired my book, Shattered Bonds, Resilient Hearts, a story. It's a story of loss, endurance, and renewal for anyone who's been cut from their child. And it's the foundation of my coaching work, presence and persistence life coaching. And it's where I help parents move from grief to grounded strength and from chaos to calm clarity. So when you rise from this kind of pain, you don't just rebuild your own life. You become a living proof that healing it really is possible, and that love, no matter how silenced, always finds a way to be heard.
Marisa, thank you for pulling back the curtain on these patterns of abuse. What we've talked about today is so important because it changes the question from what did I do wrong to what is being done to me. And that shift, that awareness, that's the first step toward healing. To our listeners, if any of this sounds familiar, know that you are not imagining it. You are not alone. And with understanding and support, recovery is absolutely possible. Until next time, stay grounded, stay clear, and keep rebuilding your sense of truth. Thank you, Marisa.
Thanks, Suzanne.